What I'm going to show you today are 3 of my favorite table saw jigs, and it really doesn't matter whether your saw looks like this, my Powermatic 66, or like the Hammer K3, or in fact at any table saw. If you make these 3 table saw jigs, you will be able to get more out of your table saw than you're probably getting currently. So let's get started with my number 3 pick, the sacrificial fence. To make the sacrificial fence, I'm using 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood. The first piece I rip is a couple of inches wider than my rip fence is tall, and it's roughly the same length, maybe just a little longer. I then rip 2 strips that are the same width as the height of my rip fence. Set a bump stop for about 2 inches, square the end of a board, and then cut off a whole bunch of 2-inch long blocks. With all the small blocks cut, I take the wide ripping, trap it between the fence and the saw blade, with the saw blade raised to its highest level. I then mark slightly in front of and behind the blade, as well as just above the blade. That's my no fastener area. Now I take everything over to the bench. I measure in about 2 inches off of each end of the narrow ripping, and I square those lines up. I'll set a block on each one of those rippings and take all the other blocks and shove them to one side. I then measure from the inside of that stack all the way over to the other block, and I get 30 1/4 inches. Excluding the 2 blocks that are sitting on the squared off lines, I've got 7 more blocks, which means I have 8 spaces. So if I divide 30 1/4 by 8, the number of spaces, what I get is right around 3 3/4 to 3 13/16. It's actually dead on in between. So what I'm going to do is I measured 3 3/4 starting on the left side, measured that over, got about midway through, and then came back and measured from the other side. With the divisions marked off on the board, I now take and attach a 2-inch block at each marking. A couple of 18 gauge pins and everything is nice and affixed. You could use screws if you prefer. I find 18 gauge pins work just fine for me. When all the blocks are attached, flip the assembly over. Take the wide fence board, make sure you keep your marks for your no fastener area facing out so you can see them. I use a square and bring the inside and outside faces of the fence in line with one another. Make it flush on the bottom and then nail it down. The final nails are in the center area around the no fastener area. Make sure you do not nail inside of that area. Although my sacrificial fence is usually used with a smaller diameter dado stack, I want to be able to use it as a sacrificial fence with my larger blades, so I don't put any fasteners where the blade might come in contact with the metal from either a screw or a nail. Once you've finished attaching the outer facing, you now have a quick and easy sacrificial fence. In order to use the sacrificial fence, it's pretty quick and easy. Because my interior board is the same width or height as my rip fence, it's really easy. Line it up, get it centered. I can clamp it at the ends or in the middle, whatever works. And now I'm ready to run my fence up against my single blade or my stack dado if I want to make a rabbet. I can also use the much taller fence to attach feather boards, L fences, and lots of other fixtures. So that sacrificial fence that I made is a really great accessory, and it can do a whole lot more than just press up against a single blade or a dado stack. In fact, I've got one here that is a commercially made version. This was made by Biesmeyer back when Biesmeyer was still making fences. And you just attach a piece of plywood to it and it becomes the perfect sacrificial fence. It's an angle iron. It's got these cam clamps that hold it tight. It's an awesome little accessory. Unfortunately, because Biesmeyer isn't really making fences anymore, I'm not sure if anybody else is making this particular, this particular production-made accessory for your fence. But given the fact that I've just shown you how to make one, you can get a whole lot of benefits from that. And the fact that it extends the face of the fence out a few inches usually doesn't cause a problem because you're not using the sacrificial fence at the full rip capacity that you have. The whole point of that sacrificial fence is that you're using it up close to be able to get in tight on the blade and potentially bury that blade in there so that you can create absolutely perfect rabbets and a few other things. So now that you've seen how I make a sacrificial fence for my table saw, let me show you my number 2 jig, which I really truly believe is one of the most versatile jigs you can possibly make for your saw. Here's how I make a tenoning jig. For the tenoning jig, I'm using 3/4 inch Baltic birch. The first thing I do is take one of the narrow strips, tuck it up underneath the little flag on the end of my rip fence, and scribe that off. That's the width of my rabbet that I need to cut. We're going to wrap this piece around the top of that flag. Hold the top of the plywood flush and scribe off the thickness of the aluminum extrusion. If you have a T-square style fence, this step won't be for you. You're just going to cut a piece that's wide enough to get to the other side of your rip fence. I'm going to use 1/2 of the 2-step method for creating the rabbet here. I've raised the blade up to the proper height. Set my fence, run the material through. Bump it over and remove the remaining material. Instead of laying the material down, I've just cut it with a second saw curve in the vertical position. Take a scrap of plywood and check the fit on the top of your fence. Make sure it slides. You might have to adjust it like I did. I had to readjust my fence and take another pass. One last double check. Everything seems to slide nice and free without binding up. Take another one of the strips, make it flush with the face of the rip fence, and hold it in position over the rabbeted board. Scribe off the rabbeted board and rip it to the final width. Take your vertical face, clamp it to the rip fence so that it sits directly on top of the table saw. Take that top board, clamp it into position so that it is down tight against the top of the rip fence, and then I can remove that whole assembly from the rip fence and head to the workbench. Clamp it in a vise. I'm going to measure up to the center of my plywood. For me, that's about 4 inches. Yours may vary. Put the mark onto the face of my vertical board. Use a rule and scribe a center line. Drill a few pilot holes. And insert some screws. When you drive the screws home, you want to make sure that their heads are slightly below the surface. Back over to the table saw, set your miter gauge to 45 degrees. We're going to make a couple of gussets that will ensure that the fence stays square to the table forever. Take one of those narrow strips of plywood, cut a 45-degree angle on one end, flip it, make a second cut. You've just now made a 45, 45, 90 triangle. And keep doing it until you have 2 or 3 gussets. If you've made your tenon jig a whole lot wider, you may need more. I'm going to use only 2, but I'm making 3 just in case I happen to split one when I screw the gussets into place. Hold the gussets up against the jig and you'll see they stick over the fence. So I'm going to scribe them off, use a square, square them up, and then we're going to cut them off on the table saw. Unfortunately, the miter gauge doesn't give me a whole lot of stability for cutting those off, so I've clamped an auxiliary board to the face of my miter gauge, run the saw through it, and now I can line up the square lines with the saw kerf on my auxiliary fence and make very accurate cuts. I came in about 4 inches off of each side of my jig to attach the gussets. Make sure the gussets are on the top side of the jig. Drill a pilot hole in each gusset. Drive in a screw, and then we're going to flip the jig over. I measured in the 4 inches, which is the outside of my gussets, and then I measured over 3/8 of an inch to find the center. I am using 3/4 inch plywood. Use a square to mark those center lines. Then I measured up so the screw would fall into the center of the gusset. Once again, drill a couple of pilot holes, drive home those screws, making sure the heads are slightly below the surface. Take that assembly back over to the table saw and take the rabbited board and clamp it underneath. We're getting close to the end here. You want to make sure that it's in snug up against the back of the rip fence. You want it to be able to slide. Once you have it clamped down, slide it off the table saw and clamp it in the vise at the bench. A few pilot holes and a few screws. And now we have a jig that should slide perfectly on the table saw. Test it out, slide it in. If it slides back and forth nice and easy, you're ready to go. Use a square to create a line where you want the fence to be on your tenoning jig. The piece I have is too long, so I hold it in place, scribe it off, and then cut it off. Head back over to the bench, line it up with that square line, clamp it in place, and you know the drill. A few pilot holes and a few screws later, and my jig will be finished. I've opted for 3 screws here. I made sure my bottom screw was up higher than I will ever cut into the jig so I don't run into it with the saw. With the tenoning jig mounted to the rip fence, it's really easy to create the cheek cuts for tenons. The vertical fence is tall enough that you can easily add clamps without fear of hitting the blade with them. It's also wide enough that you have plenty of area that if I wanted, I could clamp toggle clamps on here as well to hold my material to the vertical fence. The gussets give you a great place to hang on to the jig as you use it. Truly, that tenoning jig is one of the most versatile things you can make for your saw. In fact, you don't have to use it at all to make tenons. I certainly don't. There are a lot of other purposes that I can use it for. So here we are at my number one, the absolute top, most versatile jig that you can make for your table saw. So whether you have a cabinet saw like my Powermatic 66, or you've got a job site saw, or even a tabletop model, it's definitely worth the time and effort to jump into and make my number one jig. The most versatile jig that you can make for your table saw is a crosscut sled. So let's get busy making one. A table saw crosscut sled is a versatile, useful tool and an easy one to make. I make sleds in a variety of sizes, so I'm not constantly using a wide sled to cut off narrow boards. Today I'm using a piece of 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood, 16 inches wide by 38 inches long for the base of my sled. I have a scrap of tiger maple about 16 inches long for the runners, and 2 pieces of white pine that I've milled flat, straight, and square on all 4 surfaces that's about 3 inches wide and 38 inches long. Start by milling the stick of maple to thickness. You want the board to slip into the miter gauge slots of your saw, loose enough to slide but not rattle around. Rip 2 runners off the stick that are slightly thinner than the depth of your miter gauge slots. My slots are 3/8 of an inch, so I'm ripping at 5/16. To get ready for the assembly process, drill 2 countersunk holes in each runner, one at each end. Because the runners on my sled are 5/16 of an inch thick, and I'm using 1/2-inch plywood for the base, I decided to go with 5/8-inch screws so that the screws would have plenty of hold but not come through the base of the sled. You may need to adjust the screw size to fit your materials. Drop the runners into the miter gauge slots. Lay the plywood in place, making sure it is relatively parallel to the edge of the saw. Then slide everything out beyond the front edge of the saw far enough that you can insert the screws. Test the slide of the assembly to make sure you haven't pinched the runners in the slots. Push the assembly out the back of the saw far enough to insert the other screws. Then test again to make sure that the assembly still slides freely in the miter gauge slots. Make any adjustments if necessary. Slide the assembly out the back of the saw again and screw the rear fence in place. It doesn't need to be square to anything, but flush with the back edge of the plywood looks neat and clean. Raise the saw blade high enough to pierce the plywood base of the sled and cut all the way through. Lay a square along the saw kerf and clamp one side of the front fence to the sled base. If you're having trouble lining up with the saw kerf, cut a thin strip that slips into the saw kerf and use that as a guide for your square. Double check that your fence is still straight and then clamp it on the other side. Now you can screw the fence in place from the underside of the sled. To test, use a wide board with a straightened edge that has been ripped parallel. Make a cross cut, flip it over along its edge, and make a second cut. If you've taken an equal amount on the second cut, your sled is square. Of course, you could just check the end of the board with a square. Either way, you've made an accurate, versatile cross-cut sled in just minutes. Happy cross-cutting. Well, as you saw, making a cross-cut sled is really not all that difficult, and it certainly doesn't take a ton of time. You know, I know there are a lot of other methods of making cross-cut sleds out there, but this is the simplest one that I've found, and honestly, keep it simple and you'll get it done quickly and accurately. Take your time. Make sure you're checking everything properly before you permanently fasten it down. I don't know if you noticed, but the date that was on the bigger sled in the video is just about 10 years old at this point, and this sled is still square. I also mark on there which side is the fence and which side is the leading edge, so that I know I don't ever mix it up, because if you remember when we attached that front piece, who knows if it's square to the cut or not. This is the only one that's square, so make sure you mark it so that your sled doesn't get turned around. Now, I told you it's a really versatile jig, and without a doubt it is. If we add in just a couple of different fixtures here, and if you were here last week for bevels, chamfers, and miters, you would have seen these little triangles that I made on the CNC machine in use. So here are two that I've got that are 45, 45, 90 triangles, and then I've got two 30, 60, 90 triangles, which makes it really easy to clamp those to the jig for making miters. And I'd gotten an email from Barbara after last week's show. She's having difficulty tipping her 25-year-old Craftsman table saw over to an accurate 45. And she asked, how would I go about adjusting that, or should she just run out and buy a hammer sliding table saw? And of course that's the answer that I sent, but in reality, you don't need to go that far. If you're having trouble with your table saw and you can't get it over a 45, she likes to make boxes and miter the corners. And if she can't get the saw blade over at 45 degrees, you can take these 45, 45, 90 triangles that I created. You can obviously make them a lot smaller than this too. If I just take two of them, and then screw down a piece of plywood on top of this, I now have a 45-degree jig that will be absolutely dead on perfect, and I don't have to tilt the saw at all. All I need to do is get it set to 90 degrees. So now I just, like I said, if I just screw another piece of plywood on here, I've got the absolutely perfect jig. And if you wanted to do hexagonal boxes, we've got a 60-degree miter, because you can do the exact same thing. Take two of those, screw down a piece of plywood on top. Now you can attach the jig, that new jig, to the crosscut sled, adjust it until you get the absolute perfect miter. And if you make it wide enough, you can even put on some cam clamps to hold everything nice and tight and stable to that little jig, so you don't have to worry about things sliding around. These are just a couple of different things that you can add to a crosscut sled to make that table saw a whole lot more versatile for you. There are all kinds of things that you can add to a crosscut sled to do different things. The crosscut sled that I made in the video was actually made to be used in conjunction with the triangles, because as you can see when I put it on here, this fence is in the way for anything that would stick out. So after I made that sled in the video, I cut the ends off of it so that it was maybe about 15 inches wide. And now when I go to cut longer sticks of molding, it just runs out past. Hopefully, in this one short class, you've figured out that with my 3 jigs, there are an awful lot of things you can do on your table saw that you can't necessarily do without those 3 jigs. That's why they're my top 3 essential table saw jigs. I want to thank you for coming to the seminar, and if you've been here all month, thank you for coming to the shows. We couldn't do any of this without you. If you enjoyed this seminar, I am Chuck Bender, and if you didn't, I am Jim Heavey. Just remember that, because they're going to send you a satisfaction survey at some point. Please visit my website, acanthus.com. You can get my email address off of there. If you ever have any woodworking questions at all, like Barbara, just shoot me an email. I'm happy to respond and give you whatever kind of an answer I can. If I don't know the answer, I probably know somebody that does, and I can help you get your problem solved. I run a small school in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, and it's really great because the classes are, for the most part, 2 or 3, maybe 4 people, and that's it. It's an awesome place to come and hang out for a week. Bring your better half. There's lots to do in the area. I would love to see you here in the workshop for a class doing whatever project you'd like to do. Hopefully, I'll see you next year live and in person at the woodworking shows. Thanks for coming.